Hello, I am extremely privileged to be presenting to you this morning at the start of your conference. I have to say, when Paula Evans called, I was a bit surprised. I am no expert in Angelman syndrome. In fact, probably everything I know I've learned from Googling on the internet, going to your website and learning what I could. But I have worked in rare diseases for a number of years, and I think that's the spirit of my being asked. And so I'll share some of those experiences and a few thoughts, and maybe something will resonate for you. What I can see, looking at Angelman syndrome and what the information was out there, that this is an incredibly exciting time for your community. You're at that envious position, and I know you don't have the therapy yet, but you're at that envious position where you have therapies moving through clinical trials. You have drug companies that have been attracted to the space who are willing to invest in this disease and with the goal, hopefully, of ultimately getting to a cure. And you have this community, this robust community that has grown up and is now global, and you're connected and you're sharing and you're investing your own resources and trying to push this forward. So just an amazing moment, and I hope you have an appreciation for how far you've come. It may seem as though you still have an enormous distance to travel, and that may be true, but don't underestimate how far you've come, because already this is a remarkable story. And with that, maybe I'll say, if anybody wants to take a break and get a snack or something during this 15-minute talk, I'll give you the punchline. And the punchline is, I think being in rare diseases with a loved one or being affected yourself, it's a fight. It is a fight. You're fighting a system that doesn't always recognize you're there, certainly doesn't probably recognize your needs, almost for sure doesn't have the tools it needs to take care of you. It's a fight. And the most powerful tool you have in that fight is your story. So don't hesitate to use the tools that you have. Tell your story. Get better and better at telling your story, and don't underestimate the power of that story. So that's the punchline. Now to give you a little bit of background on myself and some of the experiences that have informed that view. So I'm a physician by training. I should acknowledge one thing just before I go into that. It's unfortunate that we're not able to be face-to-face. I would love to meet you in person. Of course, we're in this incredibly remarkable, unusual year. I'm recording this on November 1st, and the number of COVID cases in the US hit an all-time high a day ago. Europe is in the process of locking down again. Secondary to the second wave of the coronavirus. Economies are struggling, obviously, as we try to walk that tightrope. And the US is facing probably the most important election of our lifetime coming up in 2 days on November 3rd. So all of that creates anxiety and uncertainty, and I feel it. I'm sure you feel it. And I think if you have a health problem in the setting of that level of uncertainty, certainly one that is impacting the healthcare system, that compounds your anxiety. And I think if your health problem is a rare disease, it's compounded to an even greater degree. And so recognizing that, we are in an unusual context. And hopefully when you see this video, when it's presented at the time of the conference, things have stabilized a bit, maybe even some hope, a light at the end of the tunnel. But it's an important context, obviously, that we all recognize. So back to my history, I'm a physician by training, pulmonary critical care. I started my professional career at the Cleveland Clinic. And I have to say that period of time as a practicing physician was just incredibly important, rewarding, and helped shape how I think about healthcare, certainly how I think about being in the biopharmaceutical industry. And it was that opportunity to be on both sides of the table, right? I think we're all patients, or will be patients, or somebody we love is or will be a patient at some time. And we know what it feels to sit on that side of the table. And, as a physician on the other side, trying to figure out, understand, what was needed, how I could help, it gives you that holistic perspective. And I can tell you also, as a side note, as a patient, and I've been with minor health problems on the other side, you feel every bit as vulnerable as a physician sitting on that side of the table as I think as you would not being a physician, right? I mean, we are just all incredibly vulnerable when it comes to our health and comes to our healthcare system. And what all those experiences, told me is just the importance of trust. We just want to trust that that system is doing what's in the best interest of me, that that person across the table is working in my best interest, not with some other agenda, that all the other stakeholders in the system are working to try to get me the best possible outcome I can. And so trust is the most important element of that equation. And who's going to hold that healthcare system to account? And I would argue you're going to hold that system to account. The hospitals, the doctors, the drug companies, you can help hold them to account. So I left the Cleveland Clinic and went to Genzyme. It's a small biotechnology company, was at that time, grew into one of the largest ones back in the mid-90s. And I went there to work on their cystic fibrosis gene therapy program. And the gene for CF had just been cloned in 1989, and there was this incredible excitement that that was going to be the first gene therapy, and companies were beginning to come into the space, and money was being invested, and you could just feel, that hope that things were going to start moving. And I learned a tremendous amount, and I'll just share a couple things that really stood out for me during that period. And one was the CF Foundation, the role of the CF Foundation. They were the conveners of all of that. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, the patient organization, brought the drug companies, and there were 4 or 5 of small biotechs that were working in that area, and they brought us together. And we were competing, but we were working together, and they brought the academicians in. And so we had this whole community plus, and basically hosted by the CF Foundation, the patient community that was working this problem. And just, it was so informative and so powerful. And over time, and I refer, patient groups, if they want to know what good looks like, look at the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, because I think they've learned a ton, and I think they do represent excellence in this space. Beyond convening, as they grew, they began to set the guidelines, the standards. What did it mean to be a center of excellence, to be certified as a center of excellence and meet certain expectations? As they raised money, they increasingly were able to set the agenda, and they invested in some of these early investments, these early treatments, which went on to be successful, and then they got a return on that, and that money went back into the foundation and allowed them to further set the agenda and support things. And part of setting that agenda meant they were able to invest and willing to invest in ideas that other parts of the system said, not ready for prime time, not willing to take the risk. But the CF Foundation, they were willing to take the risk. They were willing to invest the money. Obviously, they had more at stake, but they had the resources to do it. And then that, of course, led to further advances. So very powerful example. The other takeaway and very highly memorable part of that whole experience was the courage that was exemplified by some of those early patient volunteers. And, if you think about it, back in the mid-90s, gene therapy, it was still a dream. I mean, we were, putting pieces of genetic material inside a virus, and we were going to be aerosolizing, spraying that virus around the room. And so we had to show that the regulators that we had all these levels of containment, there was going to be no risk of spread beyond that. And all of this had to say, wow, this thing must be really potentially dangerous. And, it might have been, I guess, we didn't know what we didn't know. And so the courage of those early patient volunteers who stepped up and who, allowed that field to go forward it was just amazing. And I have such respect for them as individuals. And we didn't, as you probably know, that we didn't get a therapy for cystic fibrosis, a gene therapy. They have a wonderful therapy now, which is built on the science. All the science at that time when going into gene therapy wasn't wasted. Furthermore, there's a number of diseases today who now have a gene therapy, again, on the backs of discoveries that were made in that early efforts around CF. So, the healthcare system and research is connected in ways you can't always predict. And so Don't underestimate the value of these early research efforts. They may lead directly, hopefully, to a cure for your specific Angelman syndrome in this case, but they are very likely, almost for sure, to have very important roles to play in the building blocks to the next breakthrough and the next breakthrough, and it will happen. That's how it happens. So after CF gene therapy experience, I'm working on the research side. I had a variety of different roles as I moved up in the company. And, as you move up to more senior levels, you get to meet important people. It's the nature, I think, of being an executive in today's world. And what I learned from all of that, I have to say, is that the absolute most impressive, most important people I met were people like you. People, who confronting this rare disease is because they had it personally or because somebody in their family had it. And, your people like you, your resilience, your determination, your thoughtfulness, your intelligence, your compassion. I mean, I just I've been truly overwhelmed by, the quality, the nature of the people, I have had an opportunity to meet working in the area of rare diseases. So I thought, I'll just share three stories. Two you may know, one for sure that you don't, that again, also have impacted me in my thinking about healthcare in general and certainly rare diseases. So one was presented last year. Emil Kakis spoke at this conference, and I know Emil and know him well, actually, and big shoes to fill. Wasn't so confident in my ability to follow him, but he told, I'm sure, the story of Ryan Dant, and Ryan being diagnosed at a young age with mucopolysaccharidosis 2, long name for a rare genetic disease, and his family, his father Mark Dant, getting that diagnosis, and what do they do? What is it? Where do they get knowledge about this? Who are the experts? Is there a treatment? Just how does it work? Where do we turn? And the Dants, they started actually, I guess the first thing they did, and if you read the Ryan Foundation website, they held a bake sale, and they raised $357, and $357. But that was the start, and then they raised a little bit more, and they found their way to Emil Kakis, a young researcher at UCLA who is struggling, working on this disease, struggling to get his research funded, and his foundation providing a little extra support to Emil, and given who Emil was, and the strength of the Dant family, and they got the thing, they got the protein, the enzyme replacement therapy developed. I got it through the FDA and infused into Ryan as the first patient treated, and Ryan's life was transformed, not cured, but transformed. And he continues to fight today for the next generation therapy and the next generation therapy. But as important as it was for Ryan to get the treatment and that helped his life be transformed, he opened the door. And he did not just open the door for MPS 2, he opened the door for MPS 1 and MPS 3 and 4 and 6 and all these other genetic diseases, who could look at Ryan's story and say, wow, that's possible. We can do that. So the other story you may well have heard of, it's got a fair amount of national attention, is a young girl by the name of Myla. I don't know Myla, I just read about her. Living with her family in Colorado, she was diagnosed with an unusual form of Batten's disease. And they didn't get a full understanding of it. And, her mother posted on Facebook and just, basically pleading, saying, can anybody help me figure out, what are the genetics behind my daughter's disease? And serendipity being what it was, or what it is, the wife of Tim Yu, a geneticist at Children's Hospital in Boston, saw the Facebook post and say, hey, Tim, this is something that you know something about. Maybe you could help here. And Tim looked at it and said, yep. And, his team and he took it on, and they dug deeply into that gene, and through a lot of work, wasn't easy. figured out what the problem was and where that other genetic defect was that was explaining her disease. And they also realized when they looked at that defect that, wow, that's a defect that could potentially be addressed by a recently approved new cutting edge technology, antisense oligonucleotides. And maybe we could do that. And so without a big pharmaceutical partner and without, huge amounts of funding, now Myla's family, they actively went into fundraising mode and were able to get some funds and help support Tim's efforts in the lab and the like, and other people volunteered their time, other experts in the community, and one of the local, I got some help with the manufacturing of the antisense nucleotide, and most importantly, the regulators allowed Tim to take that therapy directly into Myla to see if it would work. And so again, it's just an example of the system coming together, working collaboratively to solve that problem. Now, not a cure. Myla's doing unquestionably better, not cured, but these are the kinds of scientific breakthroughs that, again, help the individual open doors, get people thinking about what's possible. Wow, that was possible. Maybe we can think differently about our situation or how we're approaching this problem. So all these things build, and they build because people are telling the stories. So the third story I'll tell you, which, again, I'll never forget. This is a much more personal story. As part of my job, at Genzyme, I was heading Genzyme at the end when we were bought by Sanofi. As I travel around the world to our different subsidiaries, and I was in South Korea, and when I go, I meet with obviously our teams in the area, and also would very often, if not always, meet with patients from that community, their families, and so there was a reception for many of the patients in the Seoul area, and there was this young woman. Now, MPS II, the same disease that Ryan has, is it stunts your growth. So you're not as tall as you might be without the disease, and there's certain features. And you might look at an individual and guess that they were much younger than they are, and that was the case when I looked at this young woman, and who I subsequently learned was 21. But they came over and they said, she'd like to play the piano for you. And you have to understand that MPS II, this disease, the mucopolysaccharidosis, has many different organs involved, but some of the more prominent findings are in the joints, and your joints are scarred and contracted, and your hand is small. And so I'm looking at these hands that have very progressed disease and thinking, wow, there's just no way that she could play the piano. And she sits down and she plays the most amazing classical piece. And they situated me, of course, so I could see her hands. And her hands were moving across the keyboard, and she was playing that piece with both her fingers and the sides of her hand, and rolling her hands and hitting the notes. And I left that thinking that was the most moving, amazing piece of music I have ever heard. And again, it causes you to think differently. And that is part of her story, which becomes part of my story. And I can tell you, I walk out of that room motivated in a way you can't ever imagine, thinking about how can I help her? How can I help her community accomplish her goals, get to a better outcome for her? So again, tell your story. So I don't know if I have a lot else to tell you about rare. I think, I obviously, if you've seen one rare disease, you've seen one rare disease. But I do think, and we know there are commonalities, and the commonalities are, this issue, I think it can be summarized in the simple fact of being alone. You're given a diagnosis and you feel alone. And if you're at the beginning of that journey, if you're one of the earlier patients who was diagnosed, you may be truly alone. And then the challenge is, where do you go? Where is the knowledge? Who knows about this disease? Where are the experts? How do you become expert in a disease if you haven't seen it? It's when you've seen enough patients with a certain disease that you begin to become truly expert. And it's that not just reading and studying it, but actually seeing patients, that combination of knowledge and the experience of seeing patients that makes you truly expert. How do you become expert if you've never seen an individual? How do you even think of that as a possible diagnosis? If somebody walks in, my office and, presents with a non-specific, my world, I'm a little short of breath, I'm thinking asthma. I'm not thinking some incredibly rare genetic disease. So you think of what you've seen. So the challenge of rare is, how do you make yourself more visible? In those early worlds where there's no experts, probably no tests, and this whole conundrum of, and why would you test anyway? There's no therapy. So what difference does it make? If I don't think about it and I don't test for it, I'm not denying you any care, because there is no care for this. But and the reality is, even if there's no therapy, I want to know. And just the piece of it, if I know, then at least maybe I can do something about it. You've given me back some power and some control and ability to influence this problem. So it does matter, but the system rationalizes its failure to make that diagnosis to, it doesn't really matter. So rare diseases do have these commonalities, and I look at Angelman syndrome, and I have to say, if you are a newly diagnosed patient with Angelman syndrome, what a gift. And it's not a gift because you have this horrific, horrible diagnosis. But the gift is that you're entering this world with that diagnosis at a time when the people ahead of you have done unbelievable hard work of coming together as a community, of getting the early research done, of attracting the pharmaceutical companies to come in and invest the money and begin to systematically research and try to move this world to a cure. You come into a world where you can Google it and you can immediately connect with other people who have that disorder, who have Angelman syndrome, who live in your geography, who've been on the same odyssey, the same journey that you are embarking on now. And you can ask them, what's going to happen? And what do I expect? And what should I expect? And what should I do? And it's one thing to ask that question with nobody to answer it. It's another thing to ask that question when you've got somebody who's been there before, who can step up and say, look, it's horrific, but it's okay. And here's what you do. So I think one last thing, I'll leave you with this is, I often meet with patient families or organizations, not often, but occasionally, where they ask, what can we do to attract the attention of industry and the like? And I tell them, what I've been telling you over the past few minutes is probably the most important thing you can do as a community is to organize yourself. Make yourself studyable. Because I can tell you, as companies looking at places to invest, there's a few simple criteria, which is the biology understood? Do I know how to solve that problem? And then the second, and maybe you can help with that. You can certainly help with that with fundraising. You can certainly help with supporting, early researchers, that researchers kind of working alone, the Amyl caucuses of the world, give them their support. They will advance the ball. And once it gets to a certain point, others will pick it up. But then the question is, can we do a trial? Can we test it? And one of the challenges of, figuring out if a drug works in the traditional world, you find a group of individuals with diabetes, you pick a group of, within the big world of diabetes, you pick some of the diabetic patients who look similar in terms of their health characteristics, so that you can divide them into two groups and you just change one thing, which is one group gets a drug and the other group gets a placebo. And then you ask, how did they do? And if everything else is the same and the only difference is the drug, then if they do better, you can say, well, it's probably the drug. But the challenge in rare diseases is, A, you may not even be able to find enough patients to divide them into two groups. Second is, if you do find them and the disease is severe, as is often the case, it may seem correctly that it's unethical to put, one part of that group on a placebo. If this could work, why would you want that other group to have to be on a placebo? And so in those cases, you want to compare to natural history, but who has the natural history? Has it been collected yet? Has the community begun to collect the data that says this is what the untreated world of Angelman syndrome looks like? And so you can use that data to compare against, and then you give a drug and you say, okay, is this treated group of patients looking different, looking better than that untreated natural history group? And then the other challenge, which is we're just stuck with, which is, again, in rare diseases, because there aren't a lot of individuals, you take whoever you can. You don't get to pick and choose and say, I only want people who are a certain height and weight with, brown eyes or whatever. You take everybody. And because we're all different, then you don't have two groups necessarily that look similar. You might have two groups that are all mix of heterogeneous, all ages, all different kinds of presentations. And that, of course, makes it harder to sometimes figure out if a drug is working or not. But that's the way it is. And the better organized you are, and the more people you know, and the better characterized each one of you are, the more studyable you become. So in closing, I'll leave you with these thoughts. Don't underestimate the power of your collective voice. Don't underestimate your ability to control your own destiny. And I have to say, as you work on this field, and as you begin to make some progress, you will, and you are already entering that virtuous circle where in the beginning it's just so incredibly difficult, and the progress is so slow and so small. But as you begin to make progress, and as you begin to enter the virtuous circle of it's working, and there is a therapy that's emerging, and you're attracting attention, it begins to accelerate, and you get to this exponential virtuous circle aspect of it, where you've got a therapy and suddenly patients are being treated, and the more people are being treated, the more data is being generated, the more research is being done. And so, and then that, like I said, it just builds on itself. And all of that can be driven, as I said, like the power of an organization such as this. So there would be no treatment without you. And there will be no treatment without you. And most importantly, there will be no hope without you. If I'm a newly diagnosed patient, family, entering this community, the first and biggest gift you're going to give me is hope. So thank you for letting me be a very small part of your overall journey. I wish you the best in this conference. And,